Dr. Anne-Marie Wilson joins the Plutopia podcast this time as we discuss her long battle to outlaw FGM, female genital mutilation. Dr. Wilson's activism helped change the law in Sudan and Somalia to make FGM illegal.
But I do believe strongly that without passing a law, you'll not really ever get anywhere. So I think that actually passing the law is a good start, because at the moment in any of these countries, we could talk about Sudan, we could talk about Somalia, we could talk about Nigeria, but the same model is correct. And actually, while we did this project of one of our research projects into let's have a look at the law in each country, and we did that project across all the 28 countries in Africa to start with. We also then added the diaspora, which is a techie cut term for the places from where somebody comes and carry on the practice. That could be UK, it could be the US, it could be France, Germany, etc. And if you start to squeeze a problem from those both angles, you start to see, oh, actually, we can make a difference.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm here with my partner, Scoop Sweeney. I'm John Lebkowski, and our co-host is Wendy Grossman. And we're happy to have everybody back for yet another stimulating conversation today with Anne-Marie Wilson, who is a senior research advisor and fundraising ambassador with the Orchid Project. And she's a psychologist with over 30 years of experience. And I'm going to turn this over to Wendy.
Okay.
And we're all going to have some great questions for you today.
Okay. Well, we were directed to you, Anne-Marie, by David Miles, who's the author of How Vaccines Work, we interviewed a couple of months ago. And, you know, the stuff that you work on is one of those very difficult things to read and hear about, which is female genital mutilation. And I remember what startled me is that I remember reading about it first about 40 years ago. And to discover in your book, Anne-Marie has a book called Overcoming, looks like this. And, you know, to discover in this book that, I mean, okay, it's 3 years old, so you might want to update the statistics, but I think it was Somalia, it was over 90% or close to 90% of girls who have this done to them. And to discover that there are all these countries, I think the latest statistic I saw on the Orchid Project website was 90 countries.
Yeah.
That this is still so pervasive is shocking. And this is what you've been working to eliminate.
Yeah, that's right. I started working on this. I bumped into it, actually. I did some aid work. My background is sort of corporate HR by background, what I call messy HR, the sort of HR that no one wants to do themselves. They want to get somebody else the responsibility of getting them into it and disown it. But I started with that. And I think probably about 22 years ago, something like that, I got into aid work, started that. So I left my corporate career and worked around mostly Africa, but actually I did retrain as a basic midwife in Pakistan as well. So I birthed, I think it was 6 babies in Pakistan and 4 in Kenya, Nigeria. So I did that because if you don't know how a baby normally comes out in an uncircumcised woman, you don't know what you can do and how you can persuade people in a circumcised woman, basically. And I use the term lightly circumcised. It's nothing like male circumcision, but we may come on to that later. But in terms of those years of actually learning about that in aid work, I met a little girl who had FGM, female genital mutilation, at 5 years old in the Somalia, the Sudanese part of West Darfur, where there was an active war going on, and the armed militia had came across into where this girl lived. All the women were raped. I'm sorry to use such a brutal term. She was left for dead, but she actually was alive and pregnant from the armed militia that raped her. And we bumped into her at about 7 months when she was 7 months pregnant and gave her a safe delivery. Now, needless to say, that got my attention like big time. And actually, I'd broken my foot. I tripped over one of the doctors on our team's handbags. Doctors' handbags are very heavy. And so I popped back to the UK to get that sorted out. I got my foot sorted out. And actually, I realised then that the FGM was so significant. And actually, in that area, in Sudan, for instance, it was the high 80s and 90s, you know, those sort of figures really. And as I left, I said to God, as one does sometimes, I have got a faith. And I said to God, what are you going to do with all these girls now I'm leaving? You know, as if I could do anything beforehand. But I literally, exaggerate not, I heard the audible voice of God saying, you know, when I said, who's going to do something? He said, you will. And it's like, you are joking. So, you know, that's a very responsible position, really. I went back to my church back home and said to the pastor, you know, I'm going to help sort out the global eradication of FGM. And he said, I don't think you are. And I thought, well, yes, I am actually. So the rest is history. But I retrained myself in learning about initially with midwifery. I learned about fistulas, which is when it's like really a fancy medical term for hole. And it's where a head, you know, the hard part of a skull pushes through soft tissue, and a woman has holes in her internal organs, really, or skin anyway, and they leak, you know, often urine and fecal matter as well. So she is almost always immediately divorced by the husband. The family, the husband wants his dowry back. The family disown her because they haven't got the money to send it back. It's maybe bought camels or cattle or boys' education. And this girl wanders the streets with no place to go, leaking and smelling to high heaven. So I had to do something. It's a bit, I know it's a bit of a sobering comment, really.
Yeah. And what year was this that this kind of epiphany happened?
I think about 2005. I think that was something like that.
So almost 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. And amazingly, if we come right forward to now, actually the time now, I mean, a year or so ago, we completely finalized our mapping of FGM in Sudan. And that young girl, by the time she's 12, would be a mother, as she was, and she would have had children, her first child, who would normally get cut as well, and then she would have grandchildren at 24 years. And actually, what has happened is we've managed to persuade the Sudan government to pass a law to make it illegal to do this. And that's really incredible.
That's a really important step, as I understand, but it's also very deeply embedded in the culture, isn't it? So yeah. It's not enough just to pass a law, right? There's a lot else that has to happen.
Absolutely right. However, I do believe strongly that without passing a law, you'll not really ever get anywhere. Right. So I think that actually passing the law is a good start, because at the moment in any of these countries, we could talk about Sudan, we could talk about Somalia, we could talk about Nigeria, but the same model is correct. And actually, while we did this project of one of our research projects into let's have a look at the law in each country, and we did that project across all the 28 countries in Africa to start with. We also then added the diaspora, which is a techie cut term for the places from where somebody comes and carry on the practice. That could be UK, it could be the US, it could be France, Germany, etc. And if you start to squeeze a problem from those both angles, you start to see, oh, actually, we can make a difference. And what happened? What happened then? No, that's all right. You go ahead.
I seem to recall reading years ago about tension in the UK between the desire to allow people religious freedom and their own cultural practices, and yet wanting to stamp out this particularly unpleasant and dangerous practice. And there seemed to be some uncertainty about how to navigate that. How did you deal with that when you came across it?
Well, I think, yes, there was at the beginning. And I think perhaps people who go in very much on a feminist stance and say, you know, how do you think you can possibly do that? You know, it's outrageous, are never going to get anywhere, really. I'd got a degree in business studies, and that was very helpful for running a charity, which I eventually needed to do in order to get funds to carry on the work. I wasn't paid myself, but others were. What I also needed was cross-cultural studies. So I studied Islamics and gender and anthropology and sort of other development studies, so that I didn't leave more harm behind having got involved than I'd actually found on the ground when I arrived. So that was a useful piece. And basic Islamics, I mean, I'm not an Islamic specialist, but I have read and studied the Quran from cover to cover. And when I remember once when I was in Kenya, funnily enough, a young man listening to my talk under a tree in Kenya said, but it's in the Quran, we have to do it. And I said, no, it isn't. And they said, yes, it is. And it's like, no, it isn't. I thought, oh, we're on a pantomime sketch here. And actually, in the end, he said, well, how do you know? And I said, I've studied Islamics at university. And he said, oh, all right, it isn't. So some is credibility. And I actually finished off my doctorate in psychology. So I'd got some hope in understanding how one changes a people group. And you just can't change one person at a time. I remember meeting a family in a refugee camp, internally displaced peoples group I worked in on the Kenya Somali border. And actually the father worked originally in running a shop, and the wife worked in terms of selling items. And then they had two girls, they'd chosen to not cut both of them. And yet the 7-year-old was blinded on the way to school one day, and the 5-year-old was left intact. And these children were the victims of the community standing against the change that this family had decided upon. So it made me see for myself. I spent probably about 15, 20 years in and out of different African countries studying, and I still study now, and understanding the anthropology of different countries. And you can't ever know everything, but it did make me realize that you need to change groups of people together. So it might be all the faith leaders, the imams and the priests and whoever. Maybe you have to change the health people who might have been getting a nice little income on the side until they were retrained in something else or offered that as retraining. You have to change the chiefs who actually get a commission, let's call it, rather than using the term cut of the fee that would be achieved by each different girl that was taken to this as well. And then you have to change the mothers who it's their status for have cut girls who are right for marriage. And then the fathers who are the economic agents who would normally sell their girls and get a dowry for educating their sons and buying cattle, camels, or whatever, really. So it's very complicated. So you can't just try and change one thing without this whole dynamic. And if you do, as a person like myself, as an uncut woman, you will firstly quite likely annoy people sufficiently to come and sort you out, as I used to get offered quite often. Oh, we'll come and sort you out, Dr. Wilson, and make you a woman rather than a girl. I'm very short, well, not very short, but I'm short by Sudanese or Kenya or Somali standards, and they think I'm a girl because I don't look particularly aged. I think I am or it was anyway when I started working there. And they think of you as a child. So you can't actually advocate for anything in the community when you're deemed to be a child. But it actually helped to have a doctorate as well. And that was then deemed to be a professional, which is highly valued in Africa as well.
Well, you had to do extensive study, as you've just described, with the intention of bringing about a transformation in these cultures. But did those studies have transformative effect on you as well?
That's a good question. I think I probably, if I hadn't already, it made me, I suppose what might have just happened for a year or so has made a life change of change agenting, if there's any such description. I didn't think I'd give up my earned income for life, which is what I have done, but I have. And I think it gets under your skin as well. I always think, they always say in Kenya or Sudan, if you put your foot in the Nile, you're a sort of African in everything except skin color. But I always say to people as well, if you cut my skin, the color of my blood is the same as yours. So I try and use other things as well. And sometimes there's a lack of education. I think education is a big driver for change. I remember taking acetate out, a simple overhead projector slide acetate out with me, just one as a prompt for me to train on the anatomy of a woman, really. It literally a biology diagram, very simple, few lines. And I remember passing it around as a sort of visual aid to a few people who couldn't really understand my anatomy upside down. But I remember a man there, one particular man, sat there on the ground with my acetate right above his head, almost like a sunshade. And he was trying to visually imagine how that diagram equated to his wife's anatomy, because he could never imagine what had happened. Men don't know what happens to women. And that's actually an important thing. I think one of the things...
We know this from watching the Republicans in Congress.
There you are. I'm with you on that. So on that issue about change, if you start telling men that their sex life will be ruined by having girls cut, because they're basically cutting off, I don't know how many biological terms I'm allowed to mention, but if you basically cut out the small organ that's about the size of the tip of my finger, that is normally supposed to be the seat of all pleasure for a woman, if you cut that off and then you add the labia minora and then you add the labia majora, you've got such an open wound, you have to sew it together, which rurally is done with catgut and putting acacia thorns through. Now, if you do that, you're sealing a woman's body that was never meant to be sealed. And of course, that's the same orifice hole that a woman would actually urinate, pass her menses once she got to puberty, consummate her marriage, and have her baby. And if you think of a vertical hole, like a hole that is the circle of the diameter of a grain of rice, you've got the idea of what's done to her anatomy. And it's just not fit for purpose. And of course, what that means is that many women die in childbirth. There's one girl cut every 12 seconds at maximum. It's probably nearer 10, but we'll say 12 just to be generous with the stats. And many, many women lose their children or their own life in childbirth. And I've seen that.
Seconds or minutes? Because I thought I read minutes. Seconds?
Seconds. No, one every 12 seconds. Probably six, one every, so 6 per minute. Is that right? My maths, oral maths is never my strong point. So basically one every 12 seconds. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so 5 a minute. Well, so do you think how long I'm going to be talking? It's, an awful lot globally that are going to be traumatized physically and emotionally.
Well, I've read, you're talking about the trauma, I've read that there can be serious psychological impacts on women that have experienced this. And there can be even, physical changes that are not good for any human being, but particularly for these women. Do you deal in that end of the problem of counseling the victims?
Yes, most definitely. I worked in a gender-based violence unit in a Somali refugee camp, where the only way to get in was to fly in with a payroll. So once a month there was a payroll. So I coordinated my in and out but I was in there for the duration, really. And there I was seeing women who'd been raped, women who had been traumatized by being a newly married bride who was being run around the village, literally she couldn't go near anybody because her private parts were so bruised, she couldn't allow anything, she couldn't even sit down, let alone consummate. And quite often they'd, as a new bride and groom would be sat in a little tent-like structure in the middle of the village so that they knew when the marriage was consummated. And of course, you get couples who will try and circumnavigate the challenge of this, of maybe a mother-in-law would make a tiny, tiny incision the night before the marriage so that there would be blood showed on a sheet to show consummation had happened, or that the husband would take a small knife to the woman. But, that's not exactly the beginning of a loving relationship. And these women are literally, they often get flashbacks to the night where they were cut. And it's well known, you sometimes get poetry talking about it, the 3 tears, as well as tears, but the 3 tears of a woman's life: the night of being cut, the night of being having consummated in marriage, and then the night of having a baby come out. And as I say, there's quite a high death toll in all of those 3.
Well, just looking at this from the outside, as an outsider, it strikes me as a way to control women.
Yeah.
A way a rather brutal way to control women. But I wonder, do they not see it that way from within their culture?
What, the women? The women
are
often
women and the men, really.
Let's take them in turn. The women are often not educated for a start. They are maybe illiterate. They might, in a really positive opportunity, get a wind-up radio that they hear something. And certainly in pandemic, although there were almost no NGOs, non-government organizations, charities doing any work, they could potentially hear broadcasts. That's one positive thing. The other thing is I met, I think most of my stories appear to be somewhat depressing, but I have got a positive story where 2 young girls, 12 and 14, were separated. Well, they went to a health club because their community moved from being nomadic. They were nomadic tribe, and they moved to being pastoralists. So the girls settled into schooling, and as they went to a health club in Kenya, they learned about this FGM that they didn't know was coming their way, which is often what happens to most girls. And they ran away, one to a grandmother, one to an aunt. And their grandmother and aunt were actually very open to hearing about schooling and what they'd learned, because they probably didn't know either. And the implications, I think it's the implications of being cut on deaths of children and such the like. They didn't put the 2 and 2 together. That's the difference. It's like in Arabic, maybe it's misquoting, but inshallah, Allah wills it, the baby will live or the baby won't. So that's the sort of thing a woman would get.
Well, I mean, if they're going to make a that's the way God planned it argument, you would think the argument would be that God wouldn't have made someone that way in order for it to be removed,
Absolutely right. That's one of my biggest arguments, really. And I end up sort of in rural or church settings depressing people by talking about subjects that are normally taboo in most civilized situations, but you somehow need to, in a way. And one of them is, if we are perfectly made, and it says so in either holy book, or all 3, Christian, Jewish, or Islamic, and I've studied all 3. I was Jewish in the middle 20 years of my life, so that's come in useful. I must admit, my life experience has been jolly handy for going into this, that I never thought would happen. But in terms of men, we've talked a little bit about women and what's impacts on them, but the other side is of men as well. And one of the most useful strategies, not that I ever would have believed it, is talking to men. They don't, frankly, this is, they're not necessarily very bothered about what happens to women. It's a terrible thing to say. Of course, it's a raging generalization, but they're not, because women are bought and exchanged, a transaction agreed between the father of the girl and the husband, maybe the father of the groom, effectively, if we call it those terms. What then happens is that the boys don't know that they are firstly going to have a really poor sex life. Secondly, in no particular order, they're going to have extremely high medical bills, as their woman is going to smell from high heaven and have to have fistula surgery, corrective surgery again. And thirdly, they're going to have an extreme, this is the one that makes a difference, I might not be surprising you on this, they're going to have a really bad sex life. And suddenly when we talked about that, they took note. And 3 of my strapping young Somali men were prepared to wear, strut along with a t-shirt on, say, I'm going to marry an uncut woman.
I have wanted to make a similar argument to those opposing reproductive rights in the States.
Yeah.
That, if your wife or your girlfriend is terrified of pregnancy, it's going to be a really poor experience. But I'm given to understand that this does not land. And I don't know with what expertise I'm told this, but it's sort of like they don't expect to have anyway.
Or if the girls,
or if you're talking, no, the boys, or if you're talking to incels, for example, who are, very open about not having sex, it's not much of an argument for them.
No, that is true. But if you're talking to your normal heterosexual young man who's never had any sex, and he's like, I don't know, 12 to 15 or 40 and wants a new virgin as his 4th wife, which of course is the other end, which is probably, this is my opinion, not facts, but I believe that's a way of almost making an acceptable way of having child pedophilia, really. We call it pedophilia here, sleeping with, having sex with young 10-year-olds. The 10-year-old is married. The 11-year-old, 11, she has her period start. At 12, she has her first child, and then she'll have another one, depending how many are in that family, as she'll have it on a rotational basis.
And it's very high risk anyway. Just even without being pregnant at 12 is very high risk.
Absolutely, especially in a rural context. And I think that's the other thing as well.
So how have, the statistics I read were in your book, which was published in 2021. So how have things gone since then over the last few years?
Well, what I've been quite excited about, and I think I thought my very audacious, large goal of making a 10% reduction in 10 countries in 10 years, I thought was quite big enough for one woman in a lifetime.
Sure.
But so it's come to pass that not only has that happened, and that happened in 6 years, which is incredible actually, but we've finished the other 20, finished it cumulatively, the 28 countries in Africa. And of course, it's a bit like, I don't know if you have it in the US, but we have a phrase in the UK, like the 4th road bridge. It's like as soon as you get to one end of a bridge, you start painting at the beginning again.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, the playwright Tom Stoppard wrote a play about it.
There you are. Exactly that. So I'm on good terms here. So we have to, and I'd kind of forgotten about that when I started, because I didn't really start with this intention of doing any more than 28 reports, amen. But of course, I've gone from 28 to every year we've done one. We started in East Africa, so we did Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And then, of course, we moved from East Africa to West Africa. So I'd got a comparator group. And we've just now started, which is a very new thing, we've started having Africa networks of anti-FGM agents on the ground, if you like, organizations. And we've done a similar thing for Asia and the Middle East. So that's I'm a little bit ahead of what we're talking about. But the other thing that I never expected to do was to start in Asia or the Middle East. And we've just started in Asia, or just a few years ago, 2-3 years ago. And we've just finished our reports on Malaysia and Indonesia. Now, I didn't expect, I knew it would be high because I've traveled a bit in Indonesia, but I didn't think it would be as high as Somalia for the Indonesian stats as well. So unfortunately, Somalia is pretty much flatlining at somewhere around about 99%. So it's the only country, it was until we did Indonesia, it's very similar. It's pretty much unchanged almost no matter what we do, which you would think was depressing, but actually it's because of a very high population growth as well as a very conservative country.
So you're saying Indonesia is also around this 99% mark?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people in Indonesia.
There are. That's another reason it's very populous, one of the most populous countries, a bit like Nigeria is a very populous group or country. So that's why they're very high. And so what you have to do, I mean, actually is, again, the law, passing a law is good. There's only about 4 or 5 countries that haven't passed a law now. And there were a very large amount when I started. I mean, that's quite miraculous in and of itself.
What are the countries where it's still
We've
legal?
got Sudan, and we've got Liberia, and a couple more in that West African hub as well. Very similar countries, similar culturally as well. So they're similar, context. Because, of course, what you need to know about the map of Africa continent is that colonial borders have come and sliced up Africa. So Mali's another one. It's if you see anywhere on the continent, I can see a map behind you. There's a map behind me, but it's kind of made foggy a bit. But anywhere you see straight lines, like the country of Nigeria or the country of Mali, you realize it's colonial boundary that's being cut. Yeah. It's not natural.
There was something I read on social media a few years ago that has stuck with me very strongly, which is that anywhere in the world where there is trouble, you can trace it back to a man in Whitehall with a map and a pencil. Whitehall being the seat of the UK government.
Yeah, no, I know it well.
Well, for the benefit of Americans.
Yes.
There's something so true in that. I mean, Northern Ireland, India, Pakistan, Israel, there's just, there was a guy with a pencil and a map.
Yeah.
But that sort of leads me to one, of course, we're all Americans, even though I live in Britain, and we obviously are paying attention to the results of the recent presidential election. Does the prevailing trends in the US, do they affect your work? For example, like the fall of Roe versus Wade and sort of abortion rights now being sort of up in the air in many states, and the prevailing trends in that direction, where you sort of have some certain Republicans and Project 2025 wanting to sort of roll back to 1950 and have women sort of living in kitchens and so on. I mean, how does that affect your work?
Oh, very much so, Wendy. I mean, I think it's just tragic and true that where conservatism comes, whether it's in the US or the UK context, whether it's in some of the Middle East, and that's what we're going to find when we go there next, which would be our next continent. You can't call it continent, but that next geographic area where you actually veil women and allow them not to be educated. You know what's happened in Afghanistan and such. Afghanistan doesn't actually practice FGM, but many of the Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the likes I've been out to, and it's definitely there, but it's hidden behind the gold souks, is the kind of my lay version of reality. And that's quite depressing.
I've read that the practice of female genital mutilation predates both the origin of Christianity and Islam. So who gets the blame for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did a dissertation in one of my degrees along the way, and actually paralleled the ending of foot binding in China with the ending of FGM in Africa. And actually looking at that, I mean, you've got an opportunity to go and see it, Wendy, if you want, but actually in the UK, in the British Museum in London, which has got all sorts of things that probably didn't start off in the UK, there are sarcophagi, if that's the right word, mummified women whose bodies have had FGM or its equivalent because we can see it in the scanned remains. So it's actually I'd be a bit more sensitive what I called it, but a black on black slave practice, actually. So it's a Middle Eastern people group doing it on probably West African people initially, and it's for moving slave labor across Africa. And it was to prove that a young girl, we're talking girls, not just women, was a virgin, because a virgin would have a higher bride price or a higher slave price, because the slave master could do what he wanted with her, or there's a higher price for virginity as well. And they would actually...
Why are virgins worth more? I've never understood this.
I think we need to ask the men on our call. I think it's you could say it's to avoid any sexually transmitted diseases. That would be one. I don't think it was knowledgeably. I think the illusion is that a young girl has a hymen still in place, the covering, and that actually if that is pushed through by a man, then the woman's his part fits the woman's part neatly. And I think that supposedly gives more pleasure.
I mean, the impression I've always had, because there's always been this talk of men wanting to be with virgins or whatever, and the idea I've had, and I don't have a site for this or anything, is that there are men who just want to have women who've never been with another man and will never be with another man. It's theirs, right. It's proprietarian kind of concern. It always seemed weird to me, but
Well, they're trading domination for experience and enjoyment, but then they don't necessarily want somebody. I think if you go back to my scenario of a 40-year-old man, let's just say, marries a 10-year-old girl, the last thing he wants is experience. In fact, he might be threatened by a woman who's got lots of experience. So what better than starting with a 10-year-old who doesn't know anything? I mean, I think it's all sorts of things about threat there, perhaps. So that's
kind of weird. This is why I don't understand why women don't just take over.
They may one day. We're not there yet. It's very depressing, but I think we do see progress. That's the good news of this actually, that we have seen progress and continue to see progress, but there are some very depressing underlying things. So this was what they would do is sometimes, back to that slave scenario, they put a ring in the girl's labia. So that was the initial part to stop consummation, potentially even in the trading of women on the way out to their new site, which might be West Africa.
I mean, I see this, from in my mind, I'm thinking this is a progressive move to get away from this. And I keep thinking about how so much of the world is trying to move backwards now for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. Certainly, we have that in the US now. We want to make America great again, the way, it was great when women didn't have the vote and blacks could be slaves and whatever. It's like, do we really want to go back to that?
Oh, it's fairly awful. Maybe threatened, maybe men are, it's a raging generalization again, perhaps that certain men are threatened by the education of women. Women seem to be doing well in the UK compared to boys at school. That must be a threat. Taking jobs away, that's another perception.
Yeah, I did read something about that in the US about how a lot of young men are just kind of like sitting around playing video games and vaping and not really launching. And on the other hand, their sisters, are they've gone off to college and they're building careers and so forth.
Exactly.
And I don't know how widespread that is. I haven't seen actual statistics on it, but there's clearly a thing going on here. And women have accelerated in our culture, and there's clearly a bunch of guys who are upset about it.
I think so. And I think the other thing is that historically, men had the power and income to bring home, and that was their contribution, if you like, and women cooked and reared children and whatever. Now both sexes are equal, both genders are equal. That's unbalanced, that imbalance has occurred. I think now the issue is what to do about the emasculation of men whilst not going back too much the other way.
You know, that was one of the disappointments in the election for me, was because I really thought that Tim Walz really offers a good role model for a lot of boys, you know. I mean, he does the things that are archetypally masculine. He was a football coach. He hunts as dogs. But he seems to be a genuinely nice guy who really cares about people. And I thought, you know, great, let's have him let's have him running around, sort of giving people a different view of what masculinity can be.
Yeah, that's right.
But 'twas not to be, although he's still the governor of Minnesota, and with a much higher national profile than he had. So we'll see. You know.
Exactly.
I mean, that gets to the question of why women were voting for Trump in such numbers.
I wasn't.
Yeah, well, I don't know that one at all. I mean, I think you know, a couple of elections ago, the way that the election was won, not this round, but in England, in the UK, but the one before, was a pocket of people who'd never voted. And once they were empowered enough to vote, then it skewed the election result. The Brexit vote, that's how that was won. I mean, we could maybe compare something similarly. I think the trouble was that our perception from the UK is that Trump was very clear, and Kamala Harris was less clear about what they're going to get, and that's probably. But I don't know that that's true.
You know, and what strikes me in looking at it is that Trump's numbers have stayed pretty much stable over the last three presidential elections. You know, it's the Democrats who really went up and then went down a lot, and what that, you know, you have to think, well, okay, so the Democrats didn't make a compelling case, or not a compelling enough case to get people out to vote. You know, because as I say, Trump's numbers have stayed pretty consistent.
Yeah, I think people didn't understand the implication.
Well, as they've continued counting the votes, it's becoming much closer, and there's less than 2 points between the two now.
Really interesting.
Yeah,
there we are.
The point was made that the divide was college education versus non-college educated people, and that seemed to be where the real parting of ways came.
Yeah.
And that really troubles me, because these same people are rallying to suppress education. So not only are we going to be dumb, but we will be more so if they have their way.
Yes. And that's what won the Brexit, which is actually any right-minded person wouldn't have agreed it in hindsight. I think I only know quite a lot of people. I only know 2 people personally who voted for us to exit Europe. That in itself has taken the FGM case backwards, actually, hugely.
I know more people than that.
Yeah.
But each one had a different reason, which I found really interesting.
Yeah.
So in what ways has it taken it back?
It's lost us our seat at the table in terms of a cohesive EU to go to meetings and networks, and that was really good before. I'd go out to meetings in UN meetings quite often in Europe, and we don't now. We've lost that seat at the table, which is a shame. And I think probably you said about the American election. We used to go pre-COVID to the Commission on the Status of Women. It's gone on to Zoom now, or Zoom equivalent. And it's much more difficult for people to meet and talk in corridors. All the decisions on these things are done in corridors, face to face. and actually for a few years couldn't even get out. 3 years was lost because of COVID. And then venues have gone and we'll never get back to that. So all sorts of things have made a difference, I think, really.
One thing you talked about is changing group belief. And I think there's a lot of places in the current situation where people want to be able to do that. I don't know if you know that there's a guy, an accountant at Cambridge University, who is running a disinformation summit next year, and he's trawling for papers. And if I would really love to see somebody talking about how to change group. I'll send you a link.
Oh, thank you. Lovely.
But how you change a group belief, this is something I'm a founder of the UK magazine The Skeptic, which was originally about paranormal claims. And so what have you found works as a strategy when you're trying to actually, as you say, you have to work in groups. It can't just be one person. So how do you work at it?
I think you have to change all those 6 actors, if you like, all those kind of ones I've mentioned about the survivors, the young girls, the young boys, girls that are proud to be an uncut girl, a bit like foot binding, feet, big feet, flat feet, like I've got feet, became acceptable in a marriageability, not, want to have broken, disabled feet pointing into a daft little shoe, which actually was phallic interestingly enough. All comes back to that again. So you've got to change desirability and something that actually doesn't make any difference. That's what it was really all about back then. And also, why would you have a disabled concubine that couldn't even walk across her bedroom without holding on to railings because she was crippled, intentionally crippled? So, that's almost like having a sex slave tied up, constantly available, can never leave their room. So when you disable women like that, you lose their voice. They never meet anybody else. They never hear anything. That's the sort of thing that was going on there. And in China, what changed then was that schools only took girls who were not disabled. Teachers only taught that. And China was quite progressive. They wanted to have their population educated, unlike some of these countries that were just the opposite. If you want to have unintelligence, then it's the opposite strategy. But that was a strategy. And also in that, it was a case of making people see that the rest of the world looked down on a country, an Asian thing. It was shamed into change. Whereas the difficulty with FGM that's to change is it's seen as an African empowerment. And that's a really difficult issue, actually. If you're empowered by going through FGM, then you've got an issue really there. But I think as more and more people, girls go to camps, they learn about FGM, they've got internet, they've got blogs, things like this. There's all sorts of things globally that people can learn about things now that didn't used to be. Those 2 girls I talked about that could, they actually ran away, and they said they would only, and that story earlier, they would only go back to their family if the aunt and grandma promised them safe passage. And they talked to the whole community and told the community that this is what the rest of the world is doing, and they needed to move. Similarly, we worked with a Maasai project with Cricket Without Boundaries, or Cricket Without Borders, and we actually taught huge swathes of people, a few thousand a day, literally, to bat FGM out of Kenya with the means of teaching them cricket and repetitive snails and things like that. We found out how many brothers could then protect their sisters, how many older children could protect the younger children, etc., etc. Gave them all cricket packs and taught teachers and such like. We worked in the clinics, we worked with the chief of police. You've got to change a whole community like that for all the actors. So you can change a couple of villages or a couple of towns in a week, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I understand that.
Scaled.
I understand there are people who claim that having a medical professional perform the procedure makes it safe. Is that true or not?
It makes it less likely to die of sepsis, really, or less likely. That's all. If you don't share a blade, a razor blade, then you won't necessarily get something that the other girls have got. It's not sharing blood products. That's the only difference. You won't actually stop them getting post-traumatic stress disorder, which all girls would get, whether they realize it or not. They might not even expose it until it was that they'd have a flashback from having a baby, which we often find, or until they have a consummation of a marriage night. So these are some of the impacts that you actually take a little while to realize. But the problem is whether the girls involved actually correlate the night of FGM with the problems at consummation and the problems at having a baby. If they don't relate them back to their cutting days, then actually they just see them as isolated incidents.
Right, because it's quite it sounds like it's typically quite a long time between those.
Yes, it might be anything
if
from
the girl is cut when
5.
she's 5.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
she gets married at 12. That's an awful.
Yeah.
That's more than half her life.
And they probably would have amnesia from the trauma.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe.
Well, partial amnesia. They wouldn't know they'd had amnesia until it was done again. Something was done to them again down there.
It seems like such an odd. It seems like such an odd thing to do this kind of cutting. I was thinking that, and then I was remembering that most of men in this country have been circumcised, but it's a real different thing, I think. I mean, the one thing that's the same about it is that, you know, there is a question of how painful it is and how traumatic it is. It's certainly, most of us, you know, it happened when we were little babies and we don't really remember it, but who knows what it did, how it was to us at the time.
I think that's right. And who knows? I mean, Australia does the same. I think we don't know the impact of that. It'll be in the sort of blueprint of perfect health of the person, and maybe they get flashbacks later. Maybe there's a correlation between this and marital breakdown. Who would know, really? Who would want to prove that as well? And we have to get a bit further ahead with brain chemistry and to know the correlation of these things before we can actually work that out.
Yeah, I actually was circumcised later than most people. I was almost 2 years old. I remember it vividly, and that was my introduction to searing pain. And I'm like, well, why are you doing this? I figured my parents were trying to kill me.
Oh gosh, and that's what these girls think.
They assured me that they were not. They were just trying to do what they were supposed to have done earlier.
Gosh,
so
yes,
the old thing about the baby doesn't feel it, it's questionable.
I don't buy that either. And I think actually for me as a woman in this world, I can't stand against one and not stand against the other. Having said that, just for the record, I don't want to take on the whole of the Islamic world of maleness and the whole of the Jewish world. Otherwise my life would be even more foreshortened, really. So it's not helpful. But I don't think you can say one is child abuse and the other is not, because we do say FGM is child abuse, because it is. It's taking away perfectly healthy tissue for a non-therapeutic reason.
So when you look ahead right now, what are you hopeful about?
Well, I didn't expect to end up seeing the global eradication of FGM worldwide, or at least to see that in the law books in every country where it's practiced, it would be there, and all the diaspora countries. And I think that's in sight, and even more incredibly, in sight in my time, my lifetime, which I also didn't think either. And that is really incredible. And I think that actually, I've always thought that perhaps you do get, I mean, I think I'm a bit of a change agent, you know, I stir the pot wherever I go. which probably most people who've ever tried to employ me see. And I think that's why if I'm self-employed or as a consultant, I probably get a safer passage than if I'm employed. But I can, live with the norms of being employed and keeping to a brief. However, I do tend to stir the pot for the greater good. Even if I have to personally suffer in the short term, if it's better for society that I say something, I will tend to speak out. But I think it's that sort of, I always think of it as a jam jar of molecules or something like that. If you are an energized molecule, say, in the jam jar, and if you sit next to a whole bunch of other molecules, you can warm things up, empower people, share things, and then that warms the water, and then on you go. If everybody says to everybody else what they've learned, I think we have a cook called Jamie Oliver, you might have come across, in the US, and he tried to change the diet of people in the northeast of England or northeast of England that were not so traditionally healthy. And the idea was to teach 2 people in the first week, and then each of those to teach 2 people and 2 people and 2 people. And I actually looked at that when I was on my doing my dissertation as well, that how quickly could I get around the Somalia refugee camp of 500,000 people? And it's not very long. It's like 2 and a bit years, I think. I would love to implement that, because it is possible. I think you need a bit of funds, but significant less than people imagine. You need a few people. I need to clone myself a little bit. Not to say I'm the only one with the ideas, but there are many sort of change agents. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, different faiths, different languages, different skin color, etc. But you need people who are prepared to talk to first ladies or presidents or the Pope or all sorts of different people, anybody who is an influencer of a population group, and then have, squeeze the problem from the top down and the bottom up, really. I think that's probably what is needed.
So we're at the end of our hour, but how can people jump in? How can people support your effort?
Yeah, that'd be great. Well, I come under an umbrella of something called the Church Mission Society, so people can find me on that, and then they can sign up for a newsletter. That's really helpful, because otherwise I live on air, and it would be helpful to have a little bit that goes with the air. Other than that, Orchid Project, it's very easy to find on the website as well, and maybe your podcast can have the links of those couple of things at the back. I'm putting in my book anyway. Reading the book and sharing it would be really good as well. And then just joining, if you think, I always say at the end of a talk, what can each of the people I've talked to do differently? Who can they talk to at the bus stop? Who can they talk to in the carpool? Who can they talk to that's a health professional or a lawyer or such like? If everyone gets on board with this, it will change in our lifetime.
I hope so. I really hope so. Well, thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, absolute pleasure.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.